What up, people? In this video, I'm gonna show you another way to help your 808s cut through the mix a little bit more. Um, Now, some of you probably know when you're dealing with 808s and you're trying to get them to cut through the mix, what you're really looking for is more of um, more of a mid-range tone. And a lot of times, people what they do with bass or 808s is when they want to feel like they want to feel it more. Most times they end up just turning up the low end and the bass frequencies. And what actually happens is it really ends up fighting with your kick, and it throws off the balance of your low end. And really, what you're looking for is you're looking for that mid range that actually that your ear kind of recognizes first. Those faster frequencies. Um, So, uh, one thing that I noticed whenever I get sessions from clients or other producers is a lot of times their 808s already have distortion on there. And that's kind of to help get to do what we're talking about, help it cut through the mix. But sometimes it needs a little bit more, and you don't want to put any extra distortion in there. Um, So one of the ways I go about that, like if I have that happen, is I pull up the L3 uh, multi maximizer. Basically, it's like a multi-band compressor, except it's just a multi-band limiter, and it works exactly like a regular limiter. You can see you have your ceiling threshold, um, same controls pretty much for a basic limiter, but then you have these parameters over here which kind of allow you to prioritize what you want um, the limiter to catch and kind of accentuate. A lot of times, most limiters or compressors, most of the time, the low end content, the low end information, that's usually what it recognizes first. That's usually what it uh, that's usually what kind of pushes the signal. Is a lot of the low end content, and that's why you see on most compressors there's a high pass knob or something that allows you to say compressor don't recognize anything below this frequency. Cut all that out, and I want you to only recognize this information above this frequency, and that way it keeps your compressor from um, working on the stuff that you don't want it to work on, and it just focuses on the stuff that you want it to do. So this kind of lets you do that, except it lets you do it like in a multi-band format, and as opposed to compression, it's limiting, which is really a form of compression, but that's just a whole nother discussion. But so what I have here is a song from my guy Bags. It's a song we did, and when I brought it in, uh, like I said, I had put a distortion on the 808 when I was making the beat. So when I brought it in, I didn't really felt like it needed more distortion, but I felt like it needed to cut through a little bit more. So I brought up this L3 multi maximizer, and the first thing I do with this is the limiter over here, pretty much. Before I get into any of this multi-band stuff, I just pretty much set the limiter as if I were to use a limiter on an 808, just a regular limiter. Um, and that's a discussion as well. Sometimes you can use a limiter to not only squeeze tone out, which we're going to do here, but also to extend the sustain on the 808. Um, so like if you have an 808 that tails off, almost all 808s are going to tail off. Um, Pretty much you can control that with your threshold, and after you set your ceiling, you can kind of control how long you want that to be held, that's sustained by your threshold, and keeping it at a certain spot. What we're gonna do here is we're gonna play it, we're gonna listen to it, and then we're gonna start setting the limiter and then we'll get into some of the multi-band stuff over here and try to squeeze that mid-range tone out that we're looking for to help it cut through the mix.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so you can already kind of hear what kind of effect it's already having. I'll A B it real quick for you so you can hear it without the limiting and with the limiting real quick, and then we'll kind of dive into this multi-band section over here and how to really try to focus in on what the limiter is focusing on. So this is without the limiting after we just set the basic uh, parameters of threshold and ceiling. We're going to listen to it without first. All right, so you can kind of already hear the limiter start working, kind of the effect that it's having in terms of helping it cut through the mix. So what we're gonna do from here now is just kind of focus in on some of these settings over here and try to really dial in on really squeezing that mid range tone out and using these release times and you know these band parameters here on what we want the limiter to really focus on.
Yeah. Yeah. Chasing the cheese.
All right, so um, you could kind of hear as I was going along some of the effects that some of these settings were having. One thing that I try to do is I try to keep the release times not too far apart, and this is probably more important if you were to use this on a stereo signal or a bus signal. But I really don't. I'm not a fan of using an L3 on those kind of things. But if you were to put L3 on a on a stereo or master bus, I'd just be very mindful of of the release time, because it's just gonna affect how fast that the limiter is working, and how it's moving and behaving. So that's just something to keep in mind. So what we'll do real quick is we'll A B before the limiter and after the limiter. So I'm gonna play for you real quick before the limiter and these settings, and then we'll do after. All right, so you can kind of hear how big of a difference that makes using this L3 multi maximizer, to help your 808 cut through. And one thing to be mindful of, after you pull out some of that tone, um, you have to understand that there's vocals there still too, or there's going to be vocals. And in this case, obviously, I have his vocals muted so we can focus on the 808. Um, but when I did this, when I started doing this and started trying to process this 808, um, I knew I had to, after I got it to cut through more, I knew I was gonna have to try to cut some frequencies down a little bit, just to kind of carve out just some room for him, um, for his vocal, because his vocal is going to take up a lot of that mid-range frequency. So we still have to make sure that that takes priority there. One thing I try to do after the L3 is to cut out some of the frequencies that may be um, competing with the kick and competing with the vocal. So some of these frequencies that you see notched out down here, those are so they can blend and work with the kick well. And this broad but gentle, you know, cut here in the 2K area, that's for Bag's vocal. So it has some room to you know to still take priority there. It's usually vocals, bass, kick, and your main melody or lead. Those are the main elements. Vocals are always going to be number one on almost everything. So we need to make sure that there's room there. So that's what these cuts are for. So what I'll do is I'll play you um, before the EQ with the limiter, um, and I'll also play you with the EQ um, and the limiter. And one thing to be mindful of too, as you could kind of hear the effect and how much room was, it kind of cleaned it up a little bit, these cuts that we did. But one thing to be mindful of is your output. Uh, and this is part of gain staging, is just to be mindful of your level of your signal coming in and out of these plugins. So we made a lot of cuts, and the overall volume level went down. So it needs to be compensated for. Just be careful with it, and just use your ear, because sometimes your 808 does need to be turned down. It does need to be brought down. The overall volume. So when you make these cuts, you might not have to boost afterwards, but just be mindful of you know level matching and how you're going about your gain staging when you're in the mix process. I hope this was useful for you guys. You guys got any questions, feedback, suggestions for future videos? Just hit me, give me a shout, and I'll do my best to get to you guys. All right, peace.